Welcome to our very, very last conversation of this conference. And we've talked so much over these days, over these very interesting, exciting 2 days about all the knowledge that we know climate change is happening. We talked about how this will impact people. We talked about how our places in the landscape and in the urban areas will have to adapt, and also what are the policies that we need to improve and that we need to think about. So, but how do we make this real? That is our real question. And how do we implement these visions for our populations internationally? And so this is the point of this final panel, where we have the people in the say, I would say, as the state government of New Jersey, the federal government in Germany, and the Emscher Genossenschaft as somebody who is an important player in all of this. And our moderator will introduce you individually more, because I won't take too much time. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dean Frederick Steiner, Dean of UPenn Design, and who is, if one would reference to who do I think knows the most and is the most knowledgeable, seasoned about environmental planning in the United States, this is Professor Steiner, who I very much admire for his work. My students always have to read his work. And so my great pleasure to introduce Fritz Steiner. Fritz.
Thank you, Wolfram. And thank you to Rutgers University and to the Consulate General of the Federal Democratic Republic of Germany, the New York office, and the others who are responsible for organizing this very important gathering, and also pulling it off both in person and virtually at the same time. One of the, I think, fascinating things that have come out of this weird time we're still trying to get out of, at least here in the United States, is a reckoning of some of our past shortcomings as a people. And part of that is the acknowledgement of where we are and who was here before we were here. And in the case of New Jersey, it was the Lenape people. And a few weeks ago, the ecologist Eric Sanderson wrote in the New York Times, the Lenape people who once inhabited the hills and valleys. He was talking about New York City specifically, but of course the Lenape lived all the way from north of New York City to south of Philadelphia, which is New Jersey. Anyway, he said that the Lenape people who once inhabited the hills and valleys knew better than to dig caves in stream beds. They noted how salt marshes and barrier beaches work together to protect the coastline and to restore it after storms. They saw that soil absorbs water and that rock repels it. And if we look at New Jersey and look at the land that the Lenape inhabited, and we now look at it as, I think, the I-95 corridor. But before it was the I-95 corridor, of course, it was the fall line between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And understanding that relationship between the coastal plain and the Piedmont is really essential. So I think the Lenape people knew how to read landscapes to plan their settlements. They designed with nature rather than against the environment. And they inhabited New Jersey, what's now New Jersey, for a very long time. And I also think it's important to acknowledge the national leadership of New Jersey in environmental planning. New Jersey has been a leader in environmental planning for decades. from the Delaware Valley to the shore, with the pinelands and the rich farmlands in between. So I think for the next generation, it's how to build on that legacy, how to understand and act with the wisdom that the Lenape people had. And so it's exciting to be here. And what I'm going to do is introduce our three panelists. They're going to speak for a while, and then we'll have some discussion and questions and answers for a while. And then we'll have a reception afterwards and have a good time. So our first panelist is Sean LaTourette. He was appointed by Governor Phil Murphy to become New Jersey's Commissioner of Environmental Protection just last June, but he served as acting commissioner before that since last January. Commissioner LaTourette is responsible for formulating statewide environmental policy while directing programs that protect the public health and ensure the quality of New Jersey's air, water, and natural resources. He's a lawyer and a policymaker with 20 years experience, and he began his career really in the area of social justice, defending victims of toxic exposure. Commissioner LaTourette will be followed by Wolfram von Heitzen. And prior to becoming the Deputy Consul General of Germany in New York, had a career and had a lot of interest in cyber policy and cyber security. He also has had diplomatic posts in Israel, Ireland, and Azerbaijan. He's educated in Germany, also France and the United States. And our third panelist, Professor Dr. Uli Pranzel, has been chairman of the board of the Emscher Genossenschaft, or the Emscher Cooperative, and the Lippe Verband, or the Lippe Association, since 2016. He has a distinguished career in business and politics and was educated in both France and Germany. So I will now turn the stage over to Commissioner LaTourette.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It is an honor to be with you all. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person today. And the irony of that is not lost on me, that we have colleagues from Germany in person there at Rutgers, and here I am in Trenton, beaming it in. But thank you all for organizing this conference and for inviting us to take part in it. You know, I'm incredibly proud of the work that Governor Murphy has spearheaded. You know, coming into office 3 years ago, he made our state's commitment to reducing and responding to the impacts of climate change a primary driving force of the work that would occupy his administration, and as well it should be, right? Because New Jersey is ground zero for some of the worst impacts of climate change, which can be a hard fact to assimilate and to synthesize into the way we go about our daily lives. But the truth is that we face incredible risks in this state. We saw some of those risks come home to roost really a month ago, when the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida created such a significant flooding event, wiping out the memories and livelihoods of our fellow residents to an extreme degree. And it is shocking on the one hand, but on the other hand, not, because it's exactly the circumstances that the climate scientists have been telling us are here and are coming and will only worsen in the years ahead. And it's sobering, and it demands that we act. And that's what we've been doing here in the Murphy administration I don't know if I'm able to share a screen. It looks like I may be. And I wanted to just highlight for everyone joining us today, what our administration has been focused upon in terms of how we are able to reduce and respond to climate risk. The fact that we stand a greater risk of sea level rise, greater than most other places on the planet, in part because of our location on the eastern seaboard, in part because of the way the last ice age affected the landmass of our state, and many, many other factors. Through the great work and partnership of folks at Rutgers, we've developed the science further, and we put out the state's first ever state-specific report on climate change just last year. And we've followed that up with our work to release the state's first ever climate change resilience strategy. But there is so much work to do. And I thought what I'd do is sort of outline our approach. I'll zoom past the difficult images of what it is that we're bound to see here in New Jersey. And just spend a little time talking about what our climate policy is and how we're moving it forward. Right? The climate policy of the state of New Jersey at its highest level is simple: reduce and respond to climate change. So what does that mean? When we talk about reduce, we talk about how we can tamp down the emissions of climate pollutants, a form of climate mitigation, if you will, to stop the worsening of the climate crisis and the impacts it will visit upon us. But because we are but one state in one region, in one country, in one part of the planet, what everything that others do matters to how we're able to diminish the impacts that we'll see well into the future from climate change by reducing our emissions. So we also have to respond through adaptation, through building our resilience. And the way that we approach this within the Murphy administration, these two distinct channels of public policy, there are three legs to the stool in our minds. There's how we develop the thought leadership and directional planning documents and strategies that are going to help drive progress forward well past the existence of this one administration. On the emissions reduction side or the mitigation side, we look to our energy master plan, or the report that our agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, delivered to the legislature at the end of 2020, which is the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. The way that we have identified across every emissions sector in our state, the ways that we can reduce emissions 80% below 2006 levels by the year 2050, because that is the law of the state, the law enacted in 2007 that was further amended in 2019, the Global Warming Response Act. So there is a litany of legislative and regulatory and policy change that is necessary, all identified in the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. And then we look to incentives. How do we facilitate transition? For example, through the award of subsidies to offshore wind and solar development, how we can transition our transportation sector through electric vehicle incentives and incentives to local governments to transition school buses and garbage trucks and all of the transportation sources and medium and heavy duty equipment that we use at our ports, for example, all subject to some form of incentive structure from agencies and initiatives across the administration. But because a directional document isn't worth the paper it's written on without action, and because the private market alone cannot do the thing, we look to supportive regulatory reform for how we can adapt what is a 50-year-old environmental, legal, and regulatory structure that is not well tooled for a problem like climate change. How do we reform that entire regulatory scheme to reduce emissions? And we've launched a suite of reforms that we call climate pollutant reduction, or CPR, because we need to do CPR on our environmental laws to fight climate change, which will reduce emissions from our dirtiest power plants, that will bring down emissions of methane from pipeline leaks, that will help to facilitate the electric vehicle future through mandates and further incentives that will help to reduce emissions from the dirtiest sources of commercial and industrial facilities with boilers and other sources of carbon emissions. And at the same time, how do we improve our air quality and our public health? Not because it is along for the ride, but because it is a priority, particularly in those communities that for far too long have suffered a disproportionate burden of the pollution that we all together create. And that same structure we carry over into the climate change adaptation or resilience sphere. Thought leadership and direction, like through our scientific report and through our climate change resilience strategy. Incentives like our Blue Acres program to buy out chronically flooded properties. Programs like Resilient New Jersey, which is a planning incentive structure and tool that is helping local governments to plan. But again, because that direction itself, all the great policy thought in the world won't move the needle without the machinery of government itself changing. And again, the private market itself can't do it alone. So we are pursuing a suite of regulatory reforms, the greatest suite of regulatory reforms this agency has seen in over a generation, in what we have as our environmental land use regulatory scheme. And we call this resilient environments and landscapes are real because climate change is real, and it will change the flood hazard area control rules and the wetlands rules and the waterfront development rules, all to be more cognizant of climate risk, to demand that climate risk be analyzed at the time of development, to ensure that what we build today can stand the test of time. Because we have built out our barrier islands. We call them barriers for a reason, because they are a barrier to storm surge. We've got to protect those areas. We've got to restore the natural features that help to protect us, like our saltwater marshes, for example. We have to ensure that the development community too has skin in the game, that we're looking down the road a longer time than we do, because what we see, and Ida was a fine example of this, what we see is that we build it and we forget it. But that a piece of real estate, stormwater system, a assortment of the infrastructure that is not built with resilience in mind, it may not harm the bottom line of the builder, but it is a noose around the neck of a community that then bears the brunt of poor decisions. And we have to do better by the public. They expect better and they deserve better. And that's just a short preview of the work that we're doing. I look forward to talking with everyone here about that and how we can build partnership and community and take on this challenge, because like anything else that matters, we only do this together. Thank you.
My name is Wolfram, seems to be a very popular name at this conference. So I'm happy to be here. I believe climate change is everywhere. It affects everything actually we do in politics, in civil society work. It affects more and more of the work of companies, of enterprises, of industry. So just to give you two examples, yesterday afternoon I was sitting at a nice lunch on the East River in Manhattan, and with a Wall Street person, and it was a sunny, nice afternoon. After 2 hours of lunch, I stood up, and then this person said to me, Wolfram, you know, nothing of it was here. It was all destroyed by Sandy, and it's all rebuilt and brand new. First example. I went home, I checked my news sites, and I just learned that the 134th victim of the terrible flooding in Germany in July was identified, but wasn't identified in the region where it happened, which was the Ahrtal region close to the Rhine, close to Bonn and Cologne in Germany. No, she was found in Rotterdam, actually. So she was swept through the Ahr River into the Rhine River and down to the coastline, identified now, so the number of victims increased by one. There's still 2 unidentified or missing victims. We had damages by 13 billion by this flooding last summer, destroyed houses, everything. So that's just how you're confronted with this all the time. To answer the question at the beginning of this session, how do we implement it? Well, I think by cooperating between transatlantic-wise, but also between different sectors, politics, private sector, but particularly important civil society. We in Germany, we had now just an election, and we're going to have probably a coalition between a Green Party, a Liberal Party, and the Social Democrats, which you would call basically center-left here or progressive. It's difficult to translate these party terms into the American landscape. But the party today agreed, Germany 6 hours ahead of us, so I just heard it in the news, they gave a press conference and said the central subject, the central theme of their government will be climate change. So there is the will to do more on the political side, but it didn't come out of the blue. It came because there was pressure from civil society. Friday for Futures movement, others, they forced actually politics to move forward. They're moving forward on climate change. I'm a bit more skeptical if the same will happen to basically protect the areas where we live, protect what we have against the unavoidable consequences of climate change that we will not be able to avoid. Because when I talked about the flooding in the center of Germany, now they have a big fund for rebuilding the structures there. And I already learned that there will be a very limited amount of changing in the planning to protect the area. So basically the houses will be exactly built where they were destroyed before. And I think there is still a lot to learn to deal with the consequences. I think we've made enormous advance in the last 2 to 3 years, particularly in facing the fact that we have to do more against climate change. But I think the other question we also have to answer is, how do we deal with the unavoidable climate change that is already happening, almost that will happen, but it is already happening. So I think these are 2 separate questions, and I think it would be progress to keep these questions a bit apart from each other and answer them separately, because I think we will come up with better answers for both. We have to do both and act on both areas. If you look at politics, yes, I think politicians need to do a lot. I'm happy to hear what's already happening in New Jersey. I'm very happy about my new government. Probably we will focus on this, and we're looking forward for Glasgow in November. I think that will be progress compared to the last conference we had. So I think there's a lot of things happening, but we also need civil society. And if you see this conference here happened in the context of the transatlantic climate bridge, and then it itself is a kind of, you could say, a storm protection against the changing winds of politics, because the climate bridge was funded in 2008. That was President Bush, and there was really not a very progressive climate policy at that time in the US. Germany had a different government at that time. So we thought we need to cooperate transatlantically, because the transatlantic relations are at the core of our values, of our beliefs, and it shouldn't depend on one particular government at the time. It should be people to people, universities to universities, companies to companies, local governments with local governments, state governments with state governments. So the climate bridge was explicitly designed to enable this cooperation on all levels. And that's why it survived till today. It survived the years when climate policy in one side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic was not the top priority, but it also survived and blossomed in times when climate policy is on the top of the agenda on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm happy that today it is on the top of the agenda on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm really optimistic that we will achieve a lot and we can learn a lot. We heard the examples here about what New Jersey's done. I know what in New York, what is happening there. I know about tenders for renewable energies where German companies participate. I hear about the conference. I know about the experts, both sides of the Atlantic. Then I'm very happy why we're all here together and discuss it. I think that's exactly what we have to do, to find solutions, to find practical solutions, to get everybody involved, and to put a little bit of pressure on politics to continue the path that is moving forward nowadays. So thank you very much. And the last word to the Emscher-Genossenschaft, I just want to say, I have a very nice memory. When I was a student, I was very much interested in theater. And once I went to the Emscher-Genossenschaft because I have a sewage plant, and there was a very innovative theater project in the sewage plant. And I still remember that very vivid. So that's my memory of the Emscher-Genossenschaft. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to hear that story from your youth, your student days. Very warm welcome from my side here in Germany. Very good evening. It's a pleasure to join you. And it's a pleasure to hear, dear Commissioner, what you told us. It's really very promising and very admirable what you do in New Jersey. Some years ago, I was there, and Wolfgang Schmidt showed me a lot what is going on in New Jersey. So congratulations for that. Wolfgang Schmidt asked me to tell you a little bit about the ecological discussion in Germany, how federal government politics influences local action. Is it a top-down strategy or bottom-up? What is going on in our country? Let me start with something which is quite clear. One of the biggest challenges is, of course, climate change. It's all measurable. Extreme weather events are increasing. That's what we all know. And in Germany, the climate protection laws in the expiring legislature were described as inadequate by the Federal Constitutional Court. With a view to the liberties of the younger sections of the population, it concludes that there is a duty to tighten up and concretize previous legislative packages. And this was quite surprising for everyone, that the Federal Constitutional Court said, well, dear politicians, you have to act now. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but you have to do it now. This accords to what the European Union is doing. They proposed a Green New Deal for Europe. They started the program called Fit for 55. That means that we have to reduce CO2 pollution for 55% up to 2030. So that's quite ambitious. But they're doing it with a zero emission strategy for air, for water, for soil, for each section. For example, there is a new guideline for wastewater, which is in discussion now. And after the third sewage treatment, there's a primary, a secondarily, a tertiary. Now it comes a fourth one, which is imposed by Brussels. This is quite a good thing. And Brussels, the European Union, said to everyone, well, from now on, only sustainable green investments will be financed by the European Union. This is quite important. They grant credits only if they're sustainable. And so they changed all the political discussion with a simple text. And so now everyone knows, if I want to get money from the European Union, I have to act otherwise. This is quite important. So it is the European Union who gives us a guideline, who's very important of giving money and help for state members, even on the local level. And in Germany, the discussion is all about the reduction of CO2. And it's a very German discussion, nearly selfish. We're only discussing what can we do in Germany. We are not discussing what can we do internationally in cooperation, how can we learn from each other, how can we really have an impact for the planet. So this is quite a thing to do. And the discussion is very much about the reduction of CO2, but the politicians do not like to accept the fact that we have to adapt our cities to climate change. Climate change adaptation is, from my point of view, as important as climate change response, as you told us, dear Commissioner. So we have to act on both sides, from my point of view. The new coalition published today a 12-page paper where they showed us what they want to do in the next 4 years. And they are quite clear. We want to fulfill the Paris treatment, to reduce the heating of the world. The renewables, solar energy, windmills should be more important in the next years. There should be quite a progressive politic to help people and the industry in general to build up windmills and solar energy. And they published today that there will be an obligation for every new building to use solar energy on the roof. So even the Liberal Party, which is quite on the economic level very clear pro-market, pro-economy, they accepted that we now have to go a step forward. So this is the discussion in Germany. What was in the election days very important was a discussion about distribution. This means, from my point of view, we have the situation that poorer people will feel the consequences of climate change much more strongly, both globally and specifically here in Europe too, in our cities and neighborhoods. And we have a strong orientation towards a CO2 price as a benchmark for an ambitious climate policy. In case of doubt, this can lead to poorer people being forced to change their behavior, while other people can simply afford the additional expenditure. However, steps toward more climate protection must be democratically legitimized and enforced. This is very important from my point of view. It is therefore of great importance not to take the supposedly simple technocratic path here, but to give equal consideration to the question of burden sharing. So the water sector in Germany is a very traditional, well-known public service, an anchor of stability and trust for citizens, even during the pandemic. Its orientation toward the common good gives rise to an attribution of competence to play an active role in solving problems affecting society as a whole. The water sector bears a double responsibility for climate change. As an energy-intensive sector, it itself emits large quantities of CO2. This gives rise to the task of participating in the energy turnaround and also producing as much green energy as possible itself. At the same time, the element of water plays a central role in coping with the consequences of climate change. Adaptation strategies must be integrative and implemented accordingly. This means that urban planning and infrastructure construction must be done jointly with the water sector in the future to jointly develop the capacity to cope with extreme weather events. A key role in adapting cities to climate change is improving the ecological status of water bodies. It helps to increase protection against flooding and has significant positive effects on the quality of life of citizens in times of climate change. Within the scope of our water sector activities, we are the most important active environmental protector in Germany. And increasing ecological demands must, of course, also be reflected in our work and fundamentally strengthen the interests of the water sector. And so we are now proposing as a water sector for new government, for cities, for local mayors, a new urban planning. This means that we have to think about the sponge city, where we really build up a new green-blue infrastructure. The big cities like Berlin, Hamburg, our Ruhr region are now in the lead, and they propose to do so. There is a lot of money going into this blue-green infrastructure to make the social, ecological transformation of our country happen. So this is a little insight of the German discussion, and I'm very pleased to be with you and to discuss with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, these are three political visions indeed. All three of our panelists mentioned the deadly flooding in Germany, and as well as the flooding in New Jersey and the Northeast after Hurricane Ida. And Council Hainitz mentioned the resettlement that's occurring, and also Commissioner Latourette mentioned the importance of adaptation. Something that there's a tendency after a disaster for people to go back into where they were before and simply rebuild. And just to be a little bit personal, I'm originally from Dayton, Ohio, and Dayton was completely destroyed by a flood in 1913. A great loss of life, a great loss of property. And the city leaders, the city politicians, decided to rebuild differently. Basically, they used the best science of the day. They knew that floods would occur, and so they built a series of earthen dams, and then basically bought the land behind the dams, and then that was all. That's open space and farmland, and when there's a flood, it floods. No one is hurt, and then they let the water go, and it protected the city for over 100 years now. Oh, by the way, just for the landscape architects, for good measure, they hired the Olmsted brothers to come in and create parks and open space and make it a really beautiful green system. So my question is, in politics and policy, there's an assumption that, and I believe as Commissioner Latourette mentioned, the climate science is clear. What about science deniers? What do we do at a time when we have really good science about that can lead us to both mitigation and adaptation, but there's segments of our population that refuse to believe and even deny science? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Maybe I start on that. I think there are two different problems. One is the deniers, and that's probably the easier problem because I think in the end science will prevail. There's a Pfizer headquarters in Manhattan, and it has a sign outside, science will win. And that's not only true with COVID, I think that's in general true. Where else should I insist on that at a university, actually? So universities are temple of science, and that is clear the answer. The bigger problem I see is psychology, I would call it. You know, and in German we have the nice word called Heimat, basically where you feel at home. And if you have a flooding and your home is destroyed, what you miss most is not the valuable or the money you lost. You lost your home, and there's an understandable feeling that you want to get this back. So you want to basically that it is as it was before, like nothing happens, basically. And this feeling prevails from substantial change, because it's very hard to say, no, I give up the house here, it's not sustainable. If this was destroyed once by flooding, it will be destroyed again. So let's move somewhere else where it's safer to rebuild. And politicians have to take up this feeling, of course. Of course, in the middle of, or immediately after flooding, they don't want to tell people, well, now you lost everything, and actually I tell you, you won't go back to where you were before. So this is a difficult thing. So when we talk about political decisive action, we always have to consider also the psychological effects, and the most important thing, timing. When is the right moment to implement changes? When there is acceptance in the population by the people that you have to change, that you can't just go back to where you were before. So for me, that is an even bigger problem than denying of science.
The others? Dr. Pratzel?
Well, of course, in Germany, there are science deniers too, extremists, which even have a large influence in the media. I think science will win, yes, but the very important point is when, and if it's not too late, if science wins one day. So we have to fight, we have to discuss, we have to convince people that what we do is a good response on their real daily life problems. So it's all about a real response for the people living in our communities, our cities, and our states. So from my point of view, we have to bring together the urgent need to act on the one hand, and the participation of people for this action, and make it happen together very fast. And that's quite difficult.
Commissioner Latourette.
This is one of my favorite topics ever. So I get asked a lot about what in response to the work that we are doing, whether we're looking at putting in forward new rules or planning exercises supportive of local governments. I get asked about, what about the folks that don't believe in climate change? My response is usually, because this is New Jersey and we can be a little sassy, that you don't get to choose to believe in science. It is. You do get to choose how you react to it. You get to choose if you listen to it. And you get to choose if you use it. If you use it to enrich your life and enrich your community, you choose if you get to use it to make a better world and experience for your children and the people you love. And I think, Doctor, you said earlier that we can't approach, despite the urgency of the moment, this in a purely technocratic way. I could not agree more. That we have to approach it in a democratic way. And it is so deeply important, and it can be hard, especially given the politicization of everything in America right now. Do you get a vaccine or not? Do you wear a mask or not? You're either tough or you're weak. It's sad and it's hard. But this issue, environmental protection generally, should be the thing that unites us, because we get just the one planet. We get just the one planet. And while we're on it here together, we're going to disagree about things. And we have to try real hard to meet people where they are. I'll give you a fine example, right? I said earlier how the state of New Jersey is ground zero for some of the worst impacts of climate change. Some folks think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. I'm painfully pragmatic. That's why some of the environmentalists don't like me. But when I think about sea level rise and chronic inundation, for example, I see this sort of three dominoes The first is our Delaware Bayshore, one of the poorest places in New Jersey that is going to be underwater by the end of this decade because of a function of the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere. We've got homes falling into the sea right now. The Atlantic coast will withstand the rise longer. We tend to think of climate resilience in this state as a coastal issue. It is not, and Ida showed us that. But down there in this deep south of New Jersey, below the Mason-Dixon line, maybe our German friends that won't know what that means, but it's a Civil War era reference. It exploits a division in even this very green state, very blue state, I should say. The folks in that area, they don't want to talk to me about climate change. They don't want to hear me say the word sea level rise, but they do want help. They see that their community is changing. That creates an opportunity because we can interact about a politicized issue in a really human way. And we can connect about the issues that we share, that we want that sense of home. And we can hold on to that sense of home even if the building that holds it is in a safer place.
Thank you. I would like to sort of open it to the audience for any questions, if there's some here. I believe the idea is to come up. There's a microphone up here, so people can see you on camera. Please come on up and ask away.
Thank you very much for your contributions. I have a very simple question. We've been addressing the bigger issues like organizations, administration, government, but the individual responsibility of the citizen for all these has not been addressed to that extent so far, which I think is a problem, because we have no lack of knowledge or understanding what's happening, but our individual decisions. Family of 5 needs 5 cars. We do not walk anywhere. We always take the car. We have to buy 5 pairs of sneakers per year because they're in fashion. So we're filling the landfills. Yes, we have to address the issues now, but how can we help to reduce consumption without ruining our businesses and our industry? They live on selling things. Many of them we need, but not all of them are necessary. And sustainability means to find a balance between that. So how can you educate the population? Give them more freedom to decide the right things. What is your point on that? Thank you.
Good question. Would anybody like to pick it up?
I'll try. I think that we have to, I say this, I've been talking a lot to local government leaders whose communities have been torn apart in the storm that we recently had, in the flooding that resulted. And there is that inclination, as our friends from Germany were saying, about rebuilding exactly what was there and not changing the way we do things, right? There's this inclination we have to always do things the way we've always done them because that's the way they've always been, whether that's, buying multiple pairs of shoes when you don't need them, or not being able to see the individual's place in the greater greater fabric of this issue of climate in particular. Public education, I think, is key around these issues. We've not educated the public enough, in my mind, here in New Jersey. We talk about these issues most in spaces like this, in spaces with others who think on these issues deeply. We talk a lot to ourselves, and you've got to work harder. I think we've got to work harder to meet people where they are and explain the these abstract principles in ways people can understand and relate to. And there is no time like post a crisis to do that. So have the real hard conversations about, do you rebuild in that place? Because here's what happens if you do. The home you rebuild might become a projectile and kill someone when the next flood comes through. And I think it's in part about honesty with the public, from the government to the public, from the politicians to the public. It's easy for me. I'm not an elected person. I'm a professional. But there is a political inclination to suggest to folks that they don't have to change, that we can do all of these things that are needed to adapt to climate change, to fight emissions, and it's not going to cost us anything. Well, it is. And we've got to be more honest and help folks to understand that there is a choice in the first place. We're not great at that, especially not on this side of the Atlantic, because we think we can have everything and it shouldn't cost us anything. I think we got to take that on. That's me saying that as a matter of policy, as a matter of politics. Good luck.
Yeah, great question, actually. And I agree with the commissioner, education is the key. I have 4 kids from kindergarten to middle school, and they all focus on climate policy in school throughout the grades, basically. So I think there's a lot happening. There needs to happen more, but there is a lot happening. But also a word of warning. I think that's not enough. And there was a time in my life when I was much younger than I am now, when I thought, if I only change my individual behavior, the world will get better. And I think that's not true, actually, nowadays. So yes, individual choice is important, but we need the right framework. If you look back in history, the big changes, industrialization, which causes climate change, but also, you know, the growth of life expectancy and things like this, that had to do with individual choices, but choices that could happen in a framework that politics and the way we organize our life together, how that changed, basically. So I think we have to look at both. We have to look at individual choices, but we also have to make sure that the framework is set by politics, by the economic organization of our society, so that we can make the right choices. And I think we need both elements of that. And the bigger progress and the faster progress to achieve is actually from this framework setting. Because when we have vehicles, cars that have lower emissions or no emissions, the best case, then the choice is easier and more people will make the choice and the progress is better. If I, as an individual, decide not to drive and walk, and 10 others are not doing the same, the effect is limited. So I think, yes, you need both, but the framework issue is the one thing where we can have the biggest effect.
I would like to join Commissioner Latourette. It's a question of good politics. There is an individual responsibility, of course. Everyone has to ask himself, well, what kind of life do I want to live? Is it a sustainable one? What can I do on my own? But what can I do on my own won't save the world. So I have to be clear in politics. I have to say, okay, it is 20 companies in the world responsible for 55% of microplastics. It's 70 enterprises in the world responsible for 80% of CO2 emissions. So I can address where I have to look at and where I can find a good and a real impact in CO2 emission reduction or whatever. So we have to look in the political debate where we can find an important impact.
I couldn't agree more with either of those two things. Just to jump in real quick, I think it's a matter of when we build that framework and we push it forward. We push those who are responsible to that, especially those in buckets you just described. But we've got to give people really meaningful choices. And government, I believe, has a responsibility to create a pathway toward those choices by doing things like building incentives, by fixing regulatory schemes in a way that force private industry to do things that they wouldn't, in and of themselves, being driven by economics, choose to do if they weren't also motivated by some degree of social responsibility. Not everyone is, right? So you need the carrots and the sticks, as they say. And you have to position those opportunities for choice before people who are often shut out of meaningful choice, particularly those communities that are bearing the worst impacts of climate change already, right? It's no coincidence that a large extent of what gets flooded out in these events is affordable housing for poor and low income people. We owe it to ourselves to fix this. It's not me, it's we. And we lose that a lot in this country.
Thank you. Please come on up. We have another question from the floor. Oh, another one over here. Okay. You saw one, I saw the other.
Was it me now?
You're next.
Okay.
And then
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add a little bit on the German example of the Ahr Valley that was mentioned now, because I do a project there on land use management since a couple of years, so I know the valley and the people there quite well. And actually, it's not true that it's the people that want to stay and don't want to leave. That would be too simple. In fact, in the first weeks, many people were so horrified by that night that they wanted to leave. Is the framework we were talking about that is not flexible, because in Germany, the building stock is protected. And if the building is still there, if it can be renovated, is the legal right to keep it. With given framework, you cannot say, hey, this is maybe not a good idea to have a house there, let's move it. No, then is there. Just for the cases where it's really swept away, where there is nothing left. Then there was now a decision, and even in this case, it's only in very few cases, actually it's 30 homes, 30 properties, where it was now decided that they're not going to be allowed to rebuild this because they're kind of in the way of the flood. They will block the river in the case of a next flood. But the people were not really the problem, at least in the first weeks, and the window of opportunity is closing fast. The longer it takes, and I talk about weeks or maybe months, but not years, the less the people remember that night, and the more there is again the tendency to go back where it was. And so we talk about windows of opportunity is very small in time, the time where you can act. But I would like to add another question to Commissioner Latourette, because you have impressively talked about the policies here in New Jersey on tackling climate change. And earlier today, I was talking about the interactions between climate change and also demographic change, and that future climate change will not meet today's population, but future population that will change as well as the climate changes. It will be, in most cases, elderly, more older people, but also migration has a huge impact. If you take the example of your stay here in New Jersey, coastlines will probably see less population because people will be forced to move out. They move somewhere. We may not know, may just estimate where they go. But my question is, do you take this demographic change, the changed population in future into account? If you think about adaptation measures, if you think about climate policies, does that play a role in your policies? Thank you very much.
So yes, it has to, but no, we're not quite there yet. With respect to the forecasting of demographic change in the context of adaptation planning. We've continued to see a migration into New Jersey as opposed to out. Despite the folks that tend to move south as they age, there are a lot of new residents in our state. In the last few years in particular. And we see some particular migration from New York into New Jersey that I think will continue for some time. And it brings into focus one of the issues that I'm most concerned about, which is the demand for more density of housing, and where we identify that housing to be best situated, and how decentralized, painfully decentralized that decision-making is, and it's problematic. And to put that in context for folks who don't know, New Jersey is a home rule state, right? We flee the king. Some folks land here in New Jersey. None of them could agree with each other, and they all go their own ways and create their own towns, right? This tiny little state has 565 towns, right? All with their own jurisdiction over how things get built and where they get built, all with wildly different ideas of how they should implement the policies we set on the state level with respect to floodplain management, for example, or stormwater storage and management. And that creates both wild inequities and incredible vulnerabilities to the effects of climate change. And when we talk about framework change, that is one of the things that I think will be very difficult for us to tackle, but we must, because the answer to a lot of this, and I would imagine as we look at demographic change in the context of climate resilience planning, we'll see the obvious need that we already do to move people to more safer areas. That's going to demand us to confront home rule issues for communities that don't want high density development because it disrupts the rural character of the community that they love, that don't want to see transit oriented development, though despite the fact that it is a key to our emissions reductions goals. And so we're not yet at a place that we've really confronted that. I think IDA, for the same reasons that the speaker just mentioned, and how we have to act now in response to those that are looking to get out of difficult areas. I think that's helping to change the conversation a bit. You know, we have a program here in New Jersey called Blue Acres, where we buy up that property and we create flood storage. But one of the huge barriers to that is actually working with our local communities, because they lose something. Our mayors lose something. They lose a tax rateable. They see their municipal budgets going down. It's quite the ball of yarn, and we owe it to one another to untangle it better.
We had another question here in the audience. Please come on up. We've got them lined up like O'Hare Airport. I feel like an air traffic controller now. They're all lined up, ready to land. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, my name is Yasmin. I'm with the City of Hoboken. Thank you very much for presenting. I do have kind of a follow-up question, which I think you've already kind of touched on with your last response, but when it comes to displacement due to flooding, and you're looking at the Blue Acres program where you're acquiring land, even at eminent domain in some cases, you know, when it comes to the pushback, but then what sort of policies, you know, ahead of time, I know sometimes with disclosure, you know, that sometimes you have to talk about that you're in the floodplain and you have that likelihood you are going to flood in the next storm event, and there's not much that we can do to protect you. Is the discussion, I know as a planner by profession, is the discussion happening on the policy level of what neighborhoods do we kind of say, okay, we have to let go. We can't save you during the next storm. We have to maybe push the Blue Acres. We must, you know, make this green or open land. We can't have housing here. It's just not safe anymore. Is that discussion happening? And also, in addition to that, I have another question about stormwater utility. Is that something that New Jersey is starting to look at?
These are two of my frequently asked questions lately in the wake of Ida, both with respect to Blue Acres and stormwater utilities. So Your first question about is the policy conversation happening about we can't rebuild in this area or we got to get folks out of this area. You're not in a place for us to save you. We are not at a point in the state of New Jersey, culturally and politically, that we are having a detailed manage retreat conversation, right? That is, I mean, I think as everybody here would acknowledge, the manage retreat is like the third rail within the third rail of climate politics. It can be really hard to talk about. But what we are doing is laying the groundwork for that broader conversation with a couple of steps. First goes to your question of disclosure. I have this crazy idea that when a developer or a redevelopment entity like those that exist in Hoboken are looking to establish a new development in a flood in an area that is at risk of flood damage, and we have laws for this, that you're going to assess that risk and you're going to notice that risk in the life of the deed of that property. And that's going to do a couple of different things. It's going to put every future owner of that property on notice, but it's also going to put title companies and insurance companies and mortgage brokerages on notice. And it's going to begin to change the approach to those areas of the state, if only from a perspective of requiring more insurance, right? Or requiring flood insurance where there is not flood insurance required today, which is a difficult political proposition, saying you're going to force somebody to buy insurance. We went down that road under President Obama when he had the crazy idea we should all have health care. But we should push in that direction because it's where the market is going. We've been convening folks from the real estate investment industry, from the insurance industry, folks like Lloyd's of London and Willis Towers and mortgage brokerages like Redfin. And they all know this is the future. The folks who aren't willing to accept that future, the future of assessing the risk, building better, and making sure everybody knows the risk exists through disclosure, the only constituencies that are against that are those that only carry a short tail of risk. The builder itself that builds the thing, sells it, and goes. They're not in favor of this. But the insurance carriers, the FEMA itself that underwrites flood insurance, this is the way. But it's going to add some upfront cost, and no one likes to say that things are going to cost more, but there's a value proposition on the other hand, that those builders get to say to their buyers that we have made this more resilient for you, and that has a value. And on the second question with respect to stormwater utilities, there is not a municipal government in the state of those 565 towns that have come to DEP and said, I want to create a stormwater utility. And they should, right? Because it will create the revenue streams to better care for our infrastructure and to right size it so it can actually handle the water that we get. But when this bill was passed, even again, in Blue Jersey, the idea of doing this was called a rain tax, okay? A rain tax. So we're still pushing.
So we have another question from the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Jim Lyons, and I'm a former academician and policymaker at the federal level. And I had actually a chance to talk to Commissioner Luttrell.
I know that I can't hear you. Could you get closer to the microphone, perhaps?
Is that better?
Oh, yes, thank you.
So I'm Jim Lyons, and former academic and policymaker. And Commissioner, you and I had a chance to talk soon after you were appointed. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, but we always talk about the threats associated with climate change, and we all recognize those threats. Here in New Jersey, we've most recently dealt quite a blow as a result of climate change. But I wonder how we change our characterization of climate change to focus some on the opportunities that come with dealing with climate change, the new technologies that we're developing, the new business opportunities, and the employment that will be generated by that. I think of the new Ford plant that's going to be producing fully electric Ford trucks as an example. New opportunities for investment in my area in land conservation, land restoration, regenerative agriculture. And having spent a little time looking at land use and management patterns in New Jersey, there's a tremendous interest across many municipalities in purchasing more open space. I think the Green Acres program is probably the only thing that always is supported by New Jersey voters overwhelmingly. That is an important tool for dealing with climate change and mitigating its impacts. So I wonder how we go about the efforts to capitalize on these new opportunities. The last one I will mention is growing markets for climate, evolving markets for climate, and the opportunities to use the resources from those climate markets to make new investments in new technologies, or in fact in New Jersey, perhaps to acquire new lands and landscapes and put them to better use, not only as parklands or wildlife habitat, but as climate reserves to help to start to offset some of the adverse impacts. So I'm curious, how do we flip that switch and start to get people thinking about what possibilities come of our efforts to address climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. The panelists, other opportunities?
I think there are many. I mean, working? Yeah. I think there are many. I mean, I don't know if I should be happy about that or not, because it's caused by climate change, but there are. We develop new technologies, and we're doing this. New Jersey, New York, they have all these wind power plants now planned in front of the coast, you know, and there is technology. There's a lot of European technology, by the way, and even German technology involved to that. It's not only turbines, it's how to connect these turbines with the shore, how to basically supply the equipment to the turbines, etc. There's a whole industry developing. I was just a couple of weeks ago in a conference where the supply chain for these wind parks actually were discussed. And this is developing in the US. It has developed in Europe a little bit earlier, so I would say we have a slight advantage, but it's coming here. And I think it will be also up to us to grasp this opportunity also through transatlantic cooperation. There's a lot of potential there. The electrical vehicles, you mentioned already, I think that's an opportunity. There's more in this area. I think there is great opportunity. We have to think about new ways of farming. Yes, I think that's a potential where we can probably more learn from the US, because I think we're too densely populated in Germany to have much experience with that. But there are these opportunities. And also the challenges. I want to come back to the previous question a little bit. It's interesting. I learn a lot, actually. I like these free market-oriented solutions to risk assignment. I mean, we usually in Europe have a little bit different approach to that. We try to regulate more, but I think it's actually something where we can learn a lot from you. On the other hand, there are also similarities when you see the different levels. We may have less problems between state and municipalities. That's clearer regulated in Germany, but we have a lot of issues between federal level and state level. So there's a lot of degree, but I always defend a system with divided powers, because it also makes sure that everybody gets involved at the right level, that there's a learning process, that not everything is going into one direction, even if it might turn out to be the wrong direction. So there is learning from it. It's not the ideal system, but it's a good learning system.
So I'd just pick up on that a little, and I'd say I couldn't agree more that we have so many opportunities before us. It's the end of the week, and maybe my more cynical self is showing in this particular forum. But you know, when I'm engaging with the public, I think it's important to not be dire and to convey urgency in ways people can hear. And one of the things that I'll talk a lot about in smaller settings where the public is participating is that we have before us the an opportunity, right? To create opportunity for people in our state from out of our greatest challenge, right? That it's more opportunity driven than it is risk response. And that happens in lots of different ways. And Jim, particularly to your question related to conservation and lands management, we're about to launch our outreach around our natural and working land strategy. I've been talking to the governor a bunch about the need for a conservation and climate corps that will work on those very issues that you identified. And because we can create opportunity for folks in new industries like keeping our food waste out of the waste stream and developing anaerobic digesters that create biochar that's reusable, and having pipeline quality. I won't call it renewable natural gas because it's a waste stream, but it does present opportunities if we choose to look at it that way. And I think it's important that we do, and that there's a slew of opportunities before us, even apart from the clean energy space. Opportunities that'll speak to those in industries that will be transitioned away from, right? By maintaining some of our hard infrastructure that isn't conducive to renewable energy, but maybe conducive to better utilizing off-gassing from landfills and from food waste digestion, for example. We have a lot before us in that. And the governor actually recently formed the Council on the Green Economy, which is creating a green economic strategy for the state. And I co-chair that with the First Lady. And the whole entire thing is built around identifying all those opportunities and building a year-by-year economic strategy to advance them.
I have to add one more point, just came to my mind now. It's also a political opportunity, because I think it brought a whole new generation of people into politics or getting interested in politics. If I look at least at the situation in Europe, we always thought younger people are not interested in politics anymore. That changed with the urgency of climate change. Younger people got engaged, they got active, and they've shown the older generation, including me, that we need to take action. So that's also an opportunity for community and for getting new generation engaged in democratic processes.
Come on up to the microphone.
Hi, thanks. And Sean, this is actually just a question for you as a New Jersey resident who is very interested in the amount of food waste that ends up in our landfill and contributes to various emissions and waste and just land use. So I love that you're talking with Governor Murphy and the First Lady about this, and I'm wondering what policy is actually being enacted such that, one, it happens, and then two, that it doesn't change with a possible next administration.
Good question. So it doesn't change with a possible next administration if we have an engaged public and we build, as our friends here were saying, the demand within our civic society, and make that when we have a grassroots component to this policy change, right? When the public comes to demand things, as Jim Lyons mentioned, of green acres, where we invest as a function of our corporate business tax in open space and parks development, that has staying power. It's been around for 60 years, right? So when the public stands up and is engaged and demands these things, change can be made and maintained. With respect to food waste in particular, we did pass in our legislature, and Governor Murphy signed a food waste reduction law. And there are now in development a new regulatory scheme to promote food recycling. It's going to take some time to put the legs under this and develop the industry and develop the mechanisms for regulating it. But we're on our way, right? And that's because folks stand up and they promote this kind of progress.
Other speakers, I feel like there may be some questions on the chat, and I don't know how to access those. So there aren't. Oh, okay. So if there's anybody else, any questions? Well, then we can wrap it up. But one lesson that anthropology teaches us is that cultures are capable of adaptation. And I was quite fortunate to live and study in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, of course, is one of Germany's neighbors. It's roughly the same size as New Jersey, even more people. And one thing that always impressed me about the Netherlands, and still does, is they've had to deal with these issues much longer than the rest of us. They're under sea level, they've faced flooding, they've faced storms from the sea, and they've developed a framework that adjusts to change, and it is adaptable. So there is, I like ending on optimism and hope. And New Jersey, you're very fortunate to have a commissioner of environment who talks about love and wisdom. And all three of our panelists, I want to thank. They brought a lot of wisdom and love to this Friday afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you all so much, and I just want to really appreciate that you all made the way up here to Rutgers. Thank you for the online speakers to join us in this late afternoon or very late evening, although I know it's like really late right now. And yes, and when you, and Governor Latourette, Commissioner Latourette, when you said about what we speak in academics, and as being in academia, I want to say, yes, this is one of the moments, this is one of the things that we do, that this is a free space that we have to speak about these opportunities, and that we as a state university also see that as our task and as our obligation to be that forum, to be that space for this conversation. And so therefore, I really appreciate that you all joined us. The disadvantage that you have is that you will not be able to join us at a little reception that we're going to have in a minute. So for everybody here, please join us at the Rutgers Club, one of the nice facilities we have here at Rutgers, full of drink and food in a few minutes. So thank you all. Thank you for a great conference, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.